What is your hope this coming Easter season? The people of Jerusalem, they had big hopes for who the Messiah would be, this coming leader. This was someone who would finally put things right. And so when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on his donkey, the joy and the expectation were palatable. We see that in the waving of the palm branches and the hosannas. The problem is, though, that not that Jesus wouldn't bring big changes, it's not what anyone expected. The people had different, misaligned expectations for who their leader would be. They failed to recognize who Jesus really is. And like last week, Mark is driving us towards a clearer picture of Jesus. He is the Son of David, the Messiah. And that as such, he is the one who has the power and the authority to right wrongs, to put everything right, to establish a proper relationship with the worship of God. And the first thing we see here is that Jesus is, in fact, the Son of David. We read from just before chapter 11 because this is one of those cases where the chapter titles and the numbers don't really help us too much. Mark is building here to Jesus clearing the temple. That's where we want to get to this morning. But we have to start where he starts, and that's with blind Bartimaeus. Look at what Bartimaeus does and says. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." You'd be forgiven for not hearing that nice and clearly. Bartimaeus calls Jesus the Son of David. And you might say, so what? But this is the first time in Mark's Gospel that we've heard this title. Mark has used Son of God, he has used Son of Man, never Son of David until now. And it's a phrase, it's a title loaded with meaning. It's why we then read that many rebuked Bartimaeus and told him to be quiet. The rebuke of the crowd, it makes no sense unless this is a title that has something major connected to it. It's a messianic name. It's a title loaded with all the religious and political expectations we've talked about already. And in a few chapters' time, Mark will show us how this title, this identity, brings opposition to Jesus. He doesn't fit those political, religious expectations. And it's ultimately why they decide to kill him. But the fact that Jesus responds to this name is important because it tells us that he really is the Son of David, which is to say he is the Messiah. The healing of Bartimaeus just confirms that. Now, what's going on here? Why are we starting our Palm Sunday here? Because this is a moment where something changes in Mark's Gospel. It's a bit like when a character is revealed to be someone else. The whole story shifts and changes around them. My favourite movie of all time is The Shawshank Redemption. Still cry at the end, still makes me weep. And if you know the film, you'll know that the ending changes the entire story. We can go back to the start and see everything with fresh eyes. And Mark's Gospel is the same. This is what blind Bartimaeus teaches us and what Mark has in mind too. Next week, Easter Sunday, we'll see that Mark ends his Gospel this way. He drives us back to the beginning with a fresh vision to see who Jesus really is. With the end in place, everything else starts to fall into place. And Jesus himself, who has been so careful to keep who he is private and under wraps, he now very publicly acknowledges that he is the Son of David. He's the Messiah. And we see here how that new identity unfolds in the next chapter. This is who enters the city. The Triumphal Entry itself, it's a well-worn passage, but I'm not going to linger on it too much this morning because Mark doesn't either. He tells the whole thing in about 10 verses. And if the scene we've just read of blind Bartimaeus, if that gives us the name of authority, then the triumphal entry shows us the actions of that authority. And remember, we're building towards the real climax of this passage, the clearing of the temple. The actions of authority are quite clear. He sends the disciples to get the colt. They're to say that the Lord needs it. They're to lay their cloaks on it for him to ride on. And the people then follow suit. They lay their cloaks and their palm branches for Jesus to walk on. And that is not, as some think, a straightforward picture of humility, but a picture of a king coming to his people. These are the actions of authority. Remember, it's a triumphal entry. And the people almost grasp this. If you look at what they shout, they come pretty close, but not close enough. They say, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. They're looking forward to a kingdom, to news of a victory, to news about the Messiah, the new king to come. They're not thinking of the king himself. And you hear there the Davidic language, the David speak. Again, it's loaded with those political, religious expectations. The Messiah would oust the Romans, establish Jerusalem, bring glory back to the temple. Jesus must be here to tell us about that person. And so they shout their hosannas at the coming kingdom. How else then would we understand or explain how this crowd, the Jewish people, turn on Jesus so quickly? But of course, Jesus is the Messiah. He has come to set his people free and establish a kingdom, a new relationship with God. This is true identity and true authority that we find in Jesus. And this is the point of the triumphal entry, because what happens next tells us that this new identity, this new authority, this Jesus, he gets straight to work. Mark wants us to note very well that the authority of Jesus before he tells us something really shocking. And what we have next then is what we call a Markan sandwich. There are two fig tree stories in the middle of this passage. And in the middle of those, Jesus clears the temple. The story of the fig tree, it's like the bread of a sandwich. And the clearing of the temple is the meat of the sandwich. And what the two stories are supposed to do are help us understand the middle story. So this incident with the fruitless fig tree becomes a little acted out parable of what Jesus would do in the temple courts. Remember, this is the Son of David who has directed his entry into Jerusalem very carefully. Every detail has been taken care of. We're not to think this is a story of Jesus being grumpy. I wish it was. Because then in my grumpy moments, I could defend myself by saying, hey, even Jesus was grumpy. That's unfortunately not the case. Rather, everything Jesus did and said was carefully thought through and has a point and a purpose. And we know that because of verse 11, which is where the story really begins. It says there, Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Jesus had a good look round the temple, probably the many stalls and tables set up for the trading the next day. He then had all night to think about it. And then in the morning, his words and his actions at the fig tree, they are not off the cuff. They are deliberate and they hold a much bigger meaning. What is that meaning? What is Jesus teaching us? Well, let me break our current government protocols for a second and take us through two short walks in this passage. The first walk will show us that Jesus is Lord, not religion. You see, a fig tree with no fruit, it's the perfect picture of what was actually happening in the temple. No berries, no buds, they weren't just a sign of this tree being out of season. They could be a sign of the tree being diseased or dying. And this is an especially striking image for the disciples. They would have thought of fig trees as a symbol of prosperity. In Micah 4, for example, we're told every man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree. Zechariah 3, the same thing. In that day, each of you will invite his neighbour to sit under his vine and fig tree. But instead of finding health and prosperity, Jesus finds nothing, and he delivers a curse. Like the tree in full leaf, the activity of the temple looked promising, but it was empty. There was nothing there. Now let's think of ourselves for just a moment. We can be so busy in church. Think of all the meetings and activities and clubs and societies and interactions that we're missing at the moment. And in the new language of essential and non-essential, which meetings, activities and clubs and meetings would we cut? We can mistake busyness for faithfulness, because all our activity can be Christless. We can be busy just being busy. Or we can care a little bit more about looking busy, looking faithful, rather than being faithful. So, now without these things, we must ask the question, what is it about our church life, our church family, that really matters? And we must be careful here, because Jesus does something amazing in this passage. The fig tree's in full leaf, the temple's busy, but there's nothing in either, and Jesus does something about it. No fruit on the tree, no faith in the temple. And so Jesus has to redirect his people to the real purpose of God's house. He says, quoting Isaiah, it will be called a house of prayer. And this is prayer, folks, in a bigger sense. It's more like worship. It's a life orientated towards God. Whole life worship. And the alternative in the passage is the powerlessness of empty religion. Empty religion will not change me, because sometimes my actions, my going to church, my praying, my joining in, they can be all about me. They're not directed at who can change me for real. We can be like the men in verse 16 here, carrying their own stuff through the temple in the house of worship, but doing all their own work. That is the worst version of religion. It's about what I do, not about what God has done. And we see a little bit of this in Peter's response. He sees the withered fig tree. He points it out to Jesus. And Jesus says, have faith in God. And he explains what that faith will look like. It will work itself out in prayer. In verse 23, he says, I tell you the truth. If anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes what he says will happen, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. John Calvin said that to have faith in God means to expect to be fully assured of obtaining from God whatever we need. Whatever we need. What we need, folks, is real change. The people of Jerusalem, they thought they knew what they needed, but it wasn't the man that they welcomed into Jerusalem. That was their mistake, and it can be our mistake too. You see, our second walk through will show us the obstacles we put in place to ourselves and to others. Jesus here drives out the traders. He turns their tables over. He doesn't allow anyone to carry their stuff through the temple. And in verse 17, he states the true purpose of this building. He says, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. The nations are important here. Instead, it had become a den of robbers. And not just in the sense that you think that the money, the dodgy sets of weights and measures. It's worth saying that this market would have been set up in the largest space available, and that would have been the court of the Gentiles, the court of the nations. It's where you and I would set up our table, nice and busy, plenty of space, lots of footfall, business would be very good. But by doing this, the Jewish elders and priests were not only robbing the people literally, they were robbing the nations, the Gentiles, of their opportunity, their right to come and seek God. Jesus overturns their tables, a shocking thing to do in a busy marketplace, but he's really overturning their corrupt system. That's what they were getting rich off. That's what really angers Jesus. But it also angers the leaders. The Jewish leaders are enraged at this. And we read that the crowd are astonished, and also that the chief priests and teachers of the law began looking for a way to kill him, to kill Jesus. Their very way of life and worship were under threat. And they find themselves with that choice we all have to make. They could crown Jesus or they could kill him. Now, it's Easter season. You know what they chose. What we choose is just as important. Are we more tied to our little traditions, our religious habits, than we are to Jesus? Are we so attached to the way we do things, the way we've always done things, that we just can't cope with all of this disruption? Are we still walking with Jesus through this crisis, through these days? Or are we all at sea because we don't have our religious trappings? And let's note, there's a reason they are called trappings. Let me give you another uncomfortable question. What would Jesus overturn in our church? I'm not sure we'll think of church the same way ever again. And that might be a good thing. That might be the very thing that God is teaching his people. But what would Jesus overturn in our church? Well, way back in 1990, some of our Presbyterian leaders, they got together at a special assembly and they produced the Coleraine Declaration. And this was a commentary, very honest, on some of our flaws as a church. And I always wonder if we still recognize them. Hear what they said. They said there is a failure to pray. We are too bound by tradition. We are more committed to ourselves than we are to Christ. We are content with superficial fellowship. We have a preoccupation with finances and buildings. And we minister to ourselves more than others. Isn't that still sobering? How do we change? How do we stop ourselves getting to the point where we are obstacles to ourselves and other people and to the gospel? Well, we've been saying it already this morning. It's faith in God, not religion. And this faith, friends, can move mountains. Jesus continues to answer the disciples. He says, have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and does not doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them. No time this morning to get into that with you. That's another sermon for another day. But how do we get a faith that endures? A faith as reliable and as firm as the mountains? Well, it lies in seeing Jesus very, very clearly. He can make the blind see, so he can help us see. He's the King of heaven, but rides a donkey into his city to declare peace. He walks up to a different tree, and he takes the curse that God reserved for us, a fruitless and useless people. And he shows us a true act of worship and sacrifice by dying on the cross. Jesus was driven out of the city so that we could be brought into the presence of God. Friends, we should die to empty tradition and this idea of saving ourselves, because Jesus did it first and he did it for us. Listen, everyone else, everything else will let you down, but Jesus won't. So this Easter, for real, trust in Jesus.